This is Max from UNFTR for the MeidasTouch network. In our last several videos here on Meidas, I've been highlighting some of the serious cracks in the U.S. economic system and revealed the wholesale ineptitude on display among leadership in the Trump administration. See, there are ticking time bombs hidden all over the U.S. economy, but maybe the most explosive report yet was quietly released by the Federal Reserve just last week. And as expected, this is how the mainstream media and markets on Wall Street responded. It makes no sense. Under any other circumstance, this would be an absolute bombshell. But the chaos of the Trump administration means it's just another day in bizarro America. But I promise you, you're going to want to hear this one. So let's go. So we just released an exhaustive piece on UNFTR that pulls together some of the stories that we've broken here on Meidas, along with some new information that fully contextualizes just how deep the U.S. economic crisis goes. And it's hard to square this sentiment with how insane the returns in the stock market have been, but I think that's actually part of the story. See, investors are increasingly running out of options to get guaranteed returns, so they're just riding the wave of the stock market, which itself is riding the wave of the so-called Magnificent Seven tech stocks. But nothing explains the two-tiered economy better than the growth in the stock market and the plummeting incomes and increasing unemployment among the masses. Now, adding salt to the wound, we have the government shutdown, which is also hiding some of the degrading economic data that we usually have access to. But government agencies affected by the shutdown aren't the only ones with data. And what I'm going to share with you will absolutely blow your mind. Now, to properly set the table for this, we have to revisit and update our theme from the last Meidas video that talked about the private credit markets, and I'll link that episode in the notes below in case you missed it. So basically, after the global financial crisis, the U.S. government put stringent regulations and capital reserve requirements on the banks. The goal was to prevent them from engaging in the risky behavior that led to the Great Recession. But the years of flooding the market with cheap and easy money after the crisis and another monster liquidity flood during COVID left the banking sector flush with cash and anxious to put it to work. But oh, those darn regulations. Well, ever the ingenious industry that it is, the banks indeed found a way to put this money to work. What you're looking at here is the growth of the private credit market, or the shadow banking sector. This is just the credit portion, mind you. But even still, we're talking about a sector that grew from around $350 billion to nearly $2 trillion over the last 15 years, and it's projected to climb even higher. The technical term for this market is the NBFI, or non-bank financial intermediation market. The industry prefers to use this because of the negative connotation associated with the phrase shadow banking sector. But they're one and the same, and I think that more accurately describes what's going on here, so we're going to stick with shadow banking. Now, to be clear, this isn't just a U.S. phenomenon. It's a global one, but we're at the heart of it all. So in July of 2025, this isn't the big report, but it helps set the table. In July of 2025, the Financial Stability Board, an international body that monitors the global financial system, issued a report titled Leverage in Non-Bank Financial Intermediation. And the paper takes aim at the lack of oversight into the shadow banking market and the amount of off-balance sheet leverage in the system. So essentially, banks are allowing these shadow banking firms to gamble on loans and securities with extreme leverage, sometimes upwards of 100 times. Now, according to the paper, quote, if not properly managed, the buildup of leverage creates a vulnerability that, when subject to a shock, can propagate strains through the financial system, amplify stress, and lead to systemic disruption through two main channels, end quote. Okay, so the first channel is the originating position that is forced to unwind certain assets, and this leads to what they call unexpected liquidity demands. Now, in this case, think of the effect on home prices as an asset class when the mortgage-backed securities trades started to unwind in 2008. The second channel involves counterparties, or basically everybody else on the other side of the trade. So this can range from commercial banks and shadow banks that help syndicate the products all the way to the U.S. Treasury. So an unwinding or liquidation of distressed entities could also impose direct losses on those counterparties, leading to a cascade of financial stress resulting in forced liquidations. So that's the backdrop to explain the most bizarre revelation in recent days. So here's the closing line from this bombshell report that was released on October 15th from the Federal Reserve. Quote, "The puzzling disconnect between the tick and Form PF data on Cayman Islands holdings of U.S. Treasuries is under active investigation." Okay, this is crazy, and I'm going to do my best to explain what's going on here. In a few of our prior videos, we've talked extensively about tick data and repo markets. So as a refresher, tick is Treasury International Capital data, and it tracks the amount of money that's coming in or going out of the United States. And with the exception of Trump's Liberation Day fiasco, the United States always experiences an inflow of capital because of the high demand for US dollars, because we're the world's reserve currency. Also, the incredible performance of our stock and our bond markets. Now, the repo markets are just accounts that the Federal Reserve uses to either inject or extract liquidity from the markets. They're stabilizing mechanisms that it uses to ensure that there's enough money in the system. Now, what we've been reporting on Meidas, almost exclusively it seems, is that something strange is happening with the tick data. Fewer and fewer quote-unquote official sources, meaning foreign central banks, have been buying our treasuries. Now remember, this is how we fund our deficits. So while central banks shed US dollars in favor of other currencies and physical stores of value like gold, so-called private sources have stepped in to purchase them instead. So on the surface, it looks as though the Treasury auctions are relatively stable. And then came the white paper that the Fed released on October 15. So up until this paper was released, it was believed that hedge funds held around $400 billion in short-term treasuries. Now, these purchases aren't acts of patriotism. They make money on the actual treasury themselves, but also on something called basis trading. We'll get to that in a minute. So this amount, the $400 billion figure, came from the tick data. That's from the U.S. Treasury. But the Federal Reserve dug into what's called Form PF filings. These are hedge fund trading disclosures that have to go to the SEC. And they uncovered something very, very different. The Form PF filings show that hedge funds registered to the Cayman Islands are holding on to more than $1.8 trillion in U.S. securities. It's hard to know where to even begin with this information. First of all, the fact that the two primary economic agencies in this country, which are themselves the biggest in the world, have a $1.4 trillion reconciliation problem is alarming enough. Even more troubling is, once again, these hedge funds aren't purchasing treasuries to perform their patriotic duty and stand in where central banks are leaving, or to just earn the stable returns that the notes offer. They're leveraging them to the hilt to profit from something called a basis trade. As insane as it sounds, the treasury market is also an enormous gambling sector with trillions of dollars flowing through it. A basis trade is a very common trade in the commodities market because it allows participants to hedge against future price fluctuations. So in things like hard commodities and agriculture, this is really important because when the work is done to actually take a commodity out of the ground or produce a commodity to go to market, you want to be sure that that price is pretty stable when it finally goes out to be sold. But it turns out there's a staggering amount of basis trading also in just the treasury markets. Basically, every bond has a futures contract associated with it. So you have the present day bond and what it might be priced at in the near future. In a basis trade, an investor will purchase whichever one is cheaper and then sell the more expensive one and then hope that the values converge over time. And when you close out these positions, there's a small amount of profit in the middle, and I mean tiny. So because the treasury markets are so stable and short-term notes aren't typically all that volatile, these trades are as close to a lock as the markets offer. The problem is that there isn't a lot of money to be made here. And that's where the leverage comes in. The shadow banking sector, most notably these hedge funds, is very, very active in these markets. So in order to make these trades worthwhile, they borrow excessive amounts from investment banks to leverage these trades. So if they have $100 in one position, they might borrow 100 times that to make the investment worthwhile. So this means that most of the money in the market is actually borrowed money, which begs the question, what happens when these trades become less of a lock? Because the margins on basis trades are so slim, Even small market disruptions can trigger rapid losses, forced selling, or systemic stress. So instead of converging over time, the spot and future prices actually diverge. And this dynamic is what regulators, including the Fed and the FSB, have recently highlighted as a potential financial stability risk, especially as many of these leveraged funds operate through offshore entities like the Cayman Islands to take advantage of lighter regulation. So that means that any marginal disruptions or any changes in value, any volatility to the upside or the downside, essentially any variation beyond the expected maturity, means that these hedge funds have enormous exposure. It also means that our debt is held in what can only be considered a Ponzi scheme. So as I said in our repo market and our dollar debasement video, this is the moment that you assemble the troops. You get the Fed, the Treasury, the Senate Banking Committee, the Council of Economic Advisors, and all of the Fed member banks together to do a risk assessment of the shadow banking market. Instead, we're ripping apart the White House to make room for a gaudy ballroom. Treasury data overstated by $1.4 trillion? No problem. Just move those sconces a little bit to the left and make sure that there's enough light on my throne. Honestly, you just can't make this stuff up anymore. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR. For the full expose on Fed and Treasury activity, make sure to check out our channel at UNFTR. And also, connect with me on Blue Sky at UNFTR as well. I'd love to hear from you. As always, thanks to the Meidas Mighty for having me here, and I'll catch you next time.
Love this video? Support independent media and unlock exclusive content, ad-free videos, and custom emojis by becoming a paid member of our YouTube channel today. You can also gift memberships to others. Let's keep growing together.